Hey guys, tonight we're headed into the sleepy English village of Hawthorne Vale, a place where hedges are trimmed, tea always tastes just right, and neighbors politely wave even when they're secretly annoyed. It's the sort of town that seems lifted from a biscuit tin painting. Crimson leaves falling onto cobbled lanes, chimneys puffing gentle smoke, and quiet houses keeping generations of secrets. But just days after a family's final Thanksgiving-style autumn gathering, something would rupture, something so awful that even the daffodils wouldn't grow there the following spring. You're about to step inside a home where everything looked ordinary until you opened the wrong cupboard. A story where a son came home not to heal, but to hollow everything out. A case that left investigators whispering long after retirement. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive late to a weekend gathering in the countryside. The air smells like burnt wood and apples gone soft. Someone's boiling squash soup, and laughter drifts through a half-open window. You take a moment before knocking on the door, just breathing it in. Golden hour clings to the leaves, and inside the Hartley house, the kitchen is alive. Edward Hartley, 62, retired mechanical engineer, is carving a roast. His wife, Margaret, 58, flicks a tea towel over her shoulder as she fusses over parsnips. It's their last big dinner here. The house is going on the market too large, too full of stairs, too many memories. They've already picked a cottage in Somerset. Their two older children are doing well enough. Amelia, the eldest, just bought a flat in Manchester. Andrew, the middle child, has two toddlers and a mortgage the size of a small yacht. But it's the youngest, Jonathan, 29, who draws the eye. He doesn't help in the kitchen. He doesn't make jokes. He barely touches his food. He's seated on the far end of the table like a forgotten statue, skin pale, hoodie sleeves tugged low. When Margaret asks him about applying to hospitals again, he nods without speaking. When Edward says, "You need to find direction," Jonathan's eyes flash just for a moment, but it passes, like an eel beneath dark water. Historians still argue whether Roman family dinners were about connection or control. In this room, it's a bit of both. Margaret tries again. You know, the GP's son up the road just started a physiotherapy course in Devon. Might be something to think about. Jonathan chews his food like it betrayed him. "I'm not a dropout," he finally mutters. The room goes quiet. And here's the thing, everyone means well. Everyone tries. They raise glasses, toast to a new chapter. And Margaret snaps a photo by the fireplace before the night ends. Jonathan doesn't smile in it. He never does. That night, you hear the wind scratch at the window panes. Somewhere inside the house, a kettle clicks off. In the spare bedroom, Jonathan lies awake, staring at the ceiling. He doesn't hear birds anymore, not even the loud ones. Instead, his mind replays something else. His father's lectures, the medical dean's dismissal, the way his siblings look at him like he's a ghost that won't stop visiting. The next morning, he helps clean up. Sort of. He brings down the empty wine glasses, then vanishes again. While Edward rearranges a drawer of loose keys and Margaret tests paint swatches for the hallway, Jonathan studies something in the shed. A list, a spreadsheet, tools. Outside, a squirrel leaps from branch to branch, totally unaware it's living on the edge of a horror story. By Sunday night, the cars are packed, kisses exchanged, and the kids all drive back to their separate lives. Jonathan stays. He tells them it's just for a few more weeks, just until he gets things sorted. Margaret believes him. Or maybe she chooses to. By Monday morning, the table is cleared. The scent of rosemary has faded, and only two people remain in the house. And one of them has already made a decision. Did you know that in 17th century England, failing a medical apprenticeship could get you banned from the trade for life even if your father was a doctor? It's not the same now, of course, but failure still stings, especially when it's served with potatoes and forced affection. Upstairs, Jonathan sits in his childhood room, leafing through a red notebook. On the cover is a sticker from his university days. On the inside, lines upon lines of notes, not about anatomy, not about healing, but about how to make something disappear. The office smells faintly of burnt coffee and printed paper. It's Monday morning, 9:14. and Margaret Hartley's chair sits conspicuously empty. She's usually the first one in, quiet, punctual, always with a thermos of chamomile tea and a cardigan that somehow matches every season. By now, she'd have booted up the spreadsheet for the monthly tax audit. But today, there's no login beep, no cardigan on the back of her chair, no Margaret, her boss. Gregor Collins isn't the panicky type. But by 10:00, after a few unanswered calls and one text that reads, "Everything all right, Margaret," with a single gray tick beside it, he starts to worry, mildly at first, then progressively more. When her lunch break time rolls around and still nothing, no email, no response, no "oops, I overslept" text. He walks next door to the tiny office kitchen and mutters, "That's not like her," to nobody in particular. By 1:30, the concern hardens. He tries her husband's phone, no answer. Tries her son, Andrew, out of office. Finally, he calls the local police non-emergency line, just to be safe. You might think that small-town police laugh these off, but here's a fun fact. In the UK, missing person calls about women over 50 are taken very seriously. Statistically, they're the least likely demographic to vanish without a trace. And when they do, it's almost never good. So, 2 officers from the Vale Constabulary PC, Belinda Foster and DS Reggie Linham, are dispatched for a welfare check. They expect to find her gardening, or maybe nursing a flu. What they find is strange. You follow them up the quiet road, past crooked fence posts and overgrown verges, to the Hartley residence. The house sits still, curtains drawn, mail untouched, but the porch light is on. Despite the broad afternoon sun, odd, not alarming, but off, they knock. No answer. They try the doorbell, a muffled chime. Reggie peers in through the letterbox and immediately flinches. "It's hot," he mutters. "Feels like a sauna in there." Belinda walks around to the side and taps at the kitchen window. No response. Then she smells it. It's not the sharp rot of garbage, nor the musk of forgotten leftovers. It's heavier, sour, oily, like ammonia wrapped in death. They call it in. Within an hour, a locksmith arrives. A few neighbors peer through hedges, whispering. They were just out there Saturday, someone says, laughing in the garden, with wine. One even remembers seeing Jonathan unloading something from the boot of his car, large, black bags, but that hadn't seemed unusual at the time. Maybe yard waste, maybe storage. Historians still argue whether ancient Roman homes had privacy in the way we imagine it, says nobody, ever, at a crime scene. But it's worth pondering here, because privacy in this home was now a barrier to the truth. The door is opened. Heat floods out like a punch. You half expect tropical birds to flap out of the hallway. The officers step inside. Slow, careful. No voices call out. No dog barks. But the air feels wrong, like the house is holding its breath. Or worse, exhaling something foul. The source of the smell, not immediately clear. The first thing they notice is the silence. No TV hum, no music, no ticking clock, just the creak of floorboards under cautious boots. They call out again, still nothing. The living room is tidy, fireplace clean. No signs of struggle. A mug of tea sits cold on a side table. But the kitchen, that's where things begin to unravel. There's a pot on the stove, lid sealed, a low simmer. Belinda approaches and reaches for the handle, but Reggie stops her. Something in his gut says no. The smell is stronger here, metallic, tangy. Then they spot the gloves on the counter, industrial ones, and 3 open bottles of drain cleaner. Not your regular supermarket brand, the kind you'd need ID to buy. The kind with chemical warning labels that could knock a cow out cold. Behind the kitchen door, they find a tub. Plastic, lid half-clipped, inside something pale, not recognizable at first. Flesh, fabric. Reggie walks out of the kitchen and calls it in. We have a confirmed scene. Requesting forensic support. Now, at this point, the house is sealed. A crime scene perimeter is established. Yellow tape flutters across rose bushes. Officers knock on doors. Did you hear anything unusual over the weekend? Most say no. Some mention Jonathan's car being around late. Someone says they saw lights flickering at odd hours. Nobody thought to check in, and nobody saw Margaret or Edward after Sunday evening. A forensic team arrives that night, suited up like astronauts. They move through the home with slow, deliberate care. One of them finally lifts the lid on the pot, and then walks straight outside to be sick in the hedge. Did you know that in Victorian England, wives were sometimes tested for witchcraft if their cooking smelled wrong? This isn't that, but the idea that scent betrays horror is older than history itself. Upstairs, things only get worse. A blood-streaked notebook, missing bed sheets, a hammer on the floor beside a half-burnt candle. Not satanic, but eerie. Like someone needed atmosphere to commit. The heat, it turns out, was no accident. All the radiators were on full. The thermostat was manually cranked up, maybe to mask the smell, maybe to speed decay. But the most chilling thing, no sign of forced entry. And only one person was known to be living there with Margaret and Edward that weekend. Jonathan, the son who came home for a fresh start, the son who hadn't been seen since Monday morning. The son with chemical burns waiting for someone to ask the right questions. You stand on the front step of the Hartley house the next morning, and the yellow tape is still there, sagging slightly from the wind, fluttering against the brick like a warning left too late. Forensic vans line the drive. The door remains open, but the air that spills out now carries the bitter sting of disinfectant over something far darker. The house has turned from a home into a wound. Inside, silence has a different shape. It's the kind of silence that comes after a scream has had time to rot. The forensic team gets to work fast, methodical, no theatrics. There's a rhythm to this kind of horror. Document, collect, seal, breathe through your mouth. They start in the kitchen. The pot on the stove is tagged and removed. The contents are what you think they are. No need to describe it further. Just know this. It confirms Margaret Hartley was in that home long after anyone last saw her alive. And then they find the barrels, 2 of them, stacked near the back door. Industrial plastic, one bright blue, one green, both labeled with masking tape. Not with names, with dates. The lids are sealed tight. The moment they crack them open, every person in the room takes a step back, even with full gear on. What floats inside is not a body, not whole. You don't need to be a pathologist to recognize a hand or a shoulder. You certainly don't need credentials to feel sick when you notice the fingernails are still intact. In one corner of the room, near a mop bucket and a stack of cleaning rags, they find a pair of Edward's shoes, his glasses, his wedding ring resting in a dish of baking soda. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians truly believed the body had to remain whole to enter the afterlife. If they were right, this is the cruelest afterlife theft imaginable. There are no bodies to lift, only parts to count. By midday, it becomes clear both Edward and Margaret were killed, dismembered, and processed. There's no graceful word for it. You can try disposed or dissolved, but it won't soften the blow. The acid used in the tubs is identified as sulfuric, possibly combined with hydrochloric, not something you pick up at a supermarket. These are industrial grade, which means deliberate planning. So they dig deeper. Receipts are found in the bin, one from a hardware shop in East Hawthorne Vale, another from a chemical supplier just outside Cheltenham, both dated within a week of the murders. Both paid in cash. They check Margaret's computer, a few emails about pension plans, a recipe for lentil stew, nothing helpful. Then Edward's tablet, old schematics, some crossword puzzles. Again, nothing unusual. But it's Jonathan's room upstairs where the story sharpens its teeth. It's cleaner than you'd expect. Bed made, curtains open, except for the closet. Inside, gloves, a roll of duct tape, a cheap paper suit, the kind decorators wear, and a half-used canister of industrial bleach. The smell alone could take paint off a wall. Tucked inside a shoebox, a journal, red leather, heavy pages. On the first page, in neat block lettering, Phase 1. Materials. You feel it before you even read the next line. That cold sensation along your spine, like history just tilted sideways. Page after page of lists, sketches, costs, and instructions. Buy barrels. at least 2 tight seals. Test acid formula on animal remains. Use old gloves. Do not reuse when noise issue. Parents sleep by 10:30. You turn the pages slower now. The handwriting is calm, deliberate, almost scientific. No rants, no spirals, just method. There's a sketch of the kitchen layout, arrows pointing to where the tubs should go. Even a note about turning the heat on. Helps decomposition like neighbors think someone's still inside. Did you know that during World War II, some soldiers were trained to fake signs of life in abandoned buildings to fool enemy scouts? A lit lamp, a fresh cigarette stub. That kind of mimicry has unsettling modern uses. One more line catches your eye. Check Mum's insurance doc should be enough to vanish on, and now you understand. This wasn't rage. This wasn't a snap. This was calculus. The team bags the journal. They photograph everything down to the smallest thread. They swab the keyboard, lift prints from the doorknobs, vacuum the rug for hair and fiber. Then, they look around and ask the obvious question. Where's Jonathan? Because the only missing thing in this house is the man who planned it. Neighbors say he hadn't been seen since Monday morning. One remembers him loading a duffel bag into a silver Vauxhall around 7:30. Quiet. Hoodie pulled up. No goodbye. No questions. He left like someone heading for an exam they already studied for. And the car hasn't been spotted since. One of the officers starts checking university records. Jonathan dropped out of medical school last year, but he still had friends near Bristol. Maybe contacts, maybe somewhere to hide. Meanwhile, his face is broadcast on national news, first as a missing person, then, by late evening, as a person of interest. Across the country, someone watching TV with the volume too low turns it up just in time to see the headline scroll across the bottom. Son sought in double murder. And in one cheap flat not far from the university campus, someone quietly begins to burn their clothes in the bathtub. You slip inside the mind of a man on the run, or so he thinks. Jonathan Hartley isn't sprinting through back alleys or hiding under bridges. No, his escape is strangely calm. He checks into a short-let apartment near his old university, an anonymous brick building, with a keypad entry and no nosy concierge, the kind of place where you can disappear for $42 a night if you book off-platform and pay in cash. He uses an alias, James Ellison. Not creative, but passable. The flat smells like stale curry and bleach. He doesn't mind. He sets down his duffel bag and unzips it with surgical precision. Inside, more gloves, a prepaid phone, a meat grinder wrapped in 2 towels, and a laptop wiped so clean it might as well be factory new. You might ask, why the grinder? It's a question police would later ask as well, along with why did he keep it? And what else was he planning? Historians still argue whether medieval alchemists truly believed they could transmute sin into purity through fire. If so, Jonathan seemed to have a modern take: burn the evidence, grind the remains, and maybe, just maybe, become clean again. Too late for that, though, because while Jonathan settles in with the radiator humming and no curtains drawn, detectives are moving fast. Faster than he'd planned for. The turning point. CCTV. Police pull footage from every shop and petrol station within a 10-mile radius of Hawthorne Vale. It's slow, tedious work frame by frame. But eventually, they find him. There he is, 3 days before the murders. At a Home Pro depot, he's pushing a trolley with 2 blue drums, a jug of acid, and a multi-pack of gloves. His face is calm, focused. He even jokes with his cashier about doing a big clear-out. The receipt says cash, but the cameras don't lie. They trace another purchase at Kemsia Safe Supplies in Cheltenham. He signs a logbook, using his real name, oddly enough. Maybe he thought nobody would check, or maybe he stopped caring. By now, his face is everywhere. BBC, Sky, local radio, Jonathan Hartley. Wanted in connection to family murders. A still image from the store hood up, gaze down, but recognizable, circulates on social media. And one of his old classmates sees it. I think he's in my building, she says, and emails the tip line. She's not sure, but she remembers that hoodie, remembers seeing him dragging a heavy suitcase up the stairs a few nights ago. Alone, always alone. Police stake it out. Just before dawn, 2 unmarked cars, 4 plainclothes officers, and a battering ram waiting in the hallway. But they don't need it. Jonathan opens the door when they knock, doesn't even flinch. He says, "Took you longer than I thought," and lifts his hands. The flat is searched top to bottom. In the kitchenette, they find bleach, ammonia, more rags. In the bedroom, an open notebook listing ferry routes out of the country, France, Ireland, a scribbled note, need burner car, and in the trunk of his Vauxhall Astra parked behind the building, the meat grinder, still stained. Chemical burns stretch across both his hands, red and shiny, angry with infection. He hasn't sought treatment. His fingers are wrapped in gauze from a pound shop first aid kit, sloppy for someone who planned everything else so meticulously. They bag him, read the charges: 2 counts of murder, 1 count of obstruction, 1 count of desecration, and still, he doesn't say a word. You'd think a confession might come now, a tear, a whisper, some pitiful attempt at justification. But no, Jonathan rides in the back of the squad car like he's being chauffeured to dinner. Did you know that in ancient Greece, those convicted of murdering family members were denied burial in family tombs? Even the dead wanted nothing to do with traitors of blood. At the station, he's stripped, photographed, and booked. The forensic team matches his prints to those on the journal. The barrels and the stove knobs. His DNA is under Margaret's fingernails. There's no sign of forced entry, no evidence of outside involvement. The case is airtight before the first court date is even scheduled. But here's the thing that startles detectives the most. He didn't try to run. Not really. Yes, he vanished. Yes, he cleaned. But he stayed close. Too close. It's almost like he wanted to be caught, or he didn't think it would matter. One psychologist on the investigative team posits that Jonathan was chasing not freedom, but erasure. That once his plan was complete, he no longer cared what happened to him. The others think that's too romantic a view. He thought he was smarter than us. One of them says, folding his arms as he watches Jonathan stare blankly during booking. He thought we'd never look past the heat. As they walk him to the cell, Jonathan finally speaks. He says, quietly, "They were planning to leave without me." That's it. Not a confession, not remorse, just a statement. A wound disguised as a sentence. Later, when a reporter asks DS Reggie Linham what he remembers most about the arrest, he doesn't say the grinder, or the notebook, or the smell of that house. He just says, his face, it was like nothing had happened. Like the part of him that felt anything had been burned away with the rest. And maybe it had. The courtroom smells of fresh paint and cold stone, like a place trying too hard to stay neutral. You sit in the back row. It's quiet except for the faint shuffle of legal papers and the rhythmic tapping of a reporter's laptop keys. Cameras aren't allowed inside, but the weight of 1,000 headlines presses down on everyone's shoulders. Jonathan Hartley enters from the side door, no cuffs, but 2 guards flank him closely. His hair is trimmed. He wears a navy sweater over a white-collared shirt, just barely tucked in. The burns on his hands are healing poorly, raw and red, where the skin still weeps. He doesn't look at anyone. You could be forgiven for thinking he's a clerk or a math teacher. He doesn't look like someone who boiled his mother's head. But then again, monsters rarely wear warning labels. The Crown opens with calm brutality. They present the facts as scalpel strokes. Date and time of death, approximated through tissue degradation. Chemical composition of the acid mixture. The dismemberment pattern, arms first, then torso, then head. The contents of the red notebook, page by meticulous page. A forensic analyst explains how long it would have taken to dissolve a human femur in sulfuric acid, 5 to 7 days under heated conditions. If you're wondering, a neighbor testifies that Jonathan once asked where the fuse box was, just in case mom and dad went out of town. That was 6 weeks before the murders. A shopkeeper recognizes him from the purchase of barrels. He joked about making soup, she says, her voice cracking. I thought it was weird, but he smiled. So I laughed. Jonathan listens to it all like he's watching the weather. The prosecutor reads aloud a line from the journal. Mom has good insurance. Could carry me for 2 years if I'm smart. And just like that, motive enters the room cold, rational, handwritten. Historians still argue whether Macbeth was driven by fate or ambition. In Jonathan's case, the answer is less poetic. resentment, mixed with cold numbers. The defense is strained. They lean heavily into his mental state. They bring in a psychiatrist who claims Jonathan showed signs of schizoid personality disorder, emotional disconnection, social withdrawal, flattened affect, all possibly true. But another expert counters with equal weight. He planned, he calculated, he covered his tracks. This was not psychosis, this was choice. A third expert simply shrugs during cross-examination and says, some people do evil not because they hear voices, but because they stop listening to anything at all. And the jury listens closely. Meanwhile, the Hartley family sits frozen in the gallery. Amelia, Andrew, their partners. None of them speak to Jonathan. None of them blink when his name is called. You wonder what it's like to have your last name hijacked like that. To hear Hartley and flinch. During one break, a reporter leans over to whisper, "This is like something out of In Cold Blood, isn't it?" You nod. Not because you agree, but because it's easier than explaining why this feels worse. Because unlike Perry Smith or Richard Hickok, Jonathan had dinner with his victims 2 days before. He kissed his mother goodnight. He thanked his father for passing the salt. He looked love in the eye and sharpened his knives anyway. Did you know that in some early Anglo-Saxon courts, a son who murdered his father could be declared wolf's head outside the protection of the law, a man to be hunted like an animal? There's no such designation in modern England, but as the trial unfolds, the public sentiment leans there. On the 5th day, the Crown introduces the final piece of evidence, a voicemail left on Margaret's phone the morning after she died. Jonathan's voice, measured and flat. "Hi, Mom. Just wanted to say I'm going to stay at a friend's for a few days. Needed space. Love you." A lie. A programmed alibi. But what strikes everyone isn't the deception. It's the fact that he said "love you," because somewhere in that detached, calculated mind, the echo of affection still lingered. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe he knew it would buy him time. Either way, the courtroom goes still. You could hear a pin drop in that moment, or a heartbreak. By the end of the week, the judge calls the jury in. 12 men and women, pale and exhausted, take their seats. One glances at Jonathan. The rest avoid his eyes. The foreman stands. We find the defendant guilty on all charges. There's no gasp, no drama, just the quiet machinery of justice moving forward. Jonathan Hartley is remanded for sentencing. No emotion, no reaction, and yet, for a brief second as he's led out, his eyes flick toward Amelia. She looks away. Later that night, one of the jurors tells the press, it wasn't just the murders, it was the cold, the absence. He wasn't even angry, he just deleted them. And in that, perhaps lies the true horror. Not in what he did, but in how little it seemed to cost him. The courtroom is quiet again, but this time, it's heavier. Like the space itself is bracing for what comes next. Jonathan Hartley sits in the dock, still, blank. His defense team whispers to each other, papers rustling like dry leaves. The sentencing hearing isn't about guilt anymore, it's about consequence. And even that feels fragile under the fluorescent lights. The judge enters, robes dark as ink, expression unreadable. You almost expect a gavel, but this is England. We deal in pauses, not punctuation. He begins slowly, reading through the facts once more. The tone is deliberate, unhurried, as if each word is a stone being placed into a shallow grave. You betrayed the trust of those who raised you, he says, and you did so with meticulous planning, not in madness, but in method. Then he turns to motive, because beneath the horror, there's that nagging question. Why? The prosecution had pointed to bitterness, resentment, a deep, festering sense of failure amplified by envy toward his siblings, and humiliation at having returned home, empty-handed. And then there was the money, a $380,000 life insurance policy. Margaret had recently updated her plan, naming all 3 children, equal parts, unless, of course, 2 of them were dead. Then, everything went to the surviving child, Jonathan, a loophole that didn't require a lawyer to exploit just the cold arithmetic of a son who saw his parents not as people, but as problems. Historians still argue whether medieval English inheritance laws were designed more to protect land than family, but the echoes remain. And in this case, that inheritance felt like the final nail. The court reads aloud a snippet from the notebook again, this one darker than the rest. They act like I'm the failure, but I'm the one cleaning up their mess. They left me behind. I'm just returning the favor. There it is, more than money, more than madness, vengeance. Dressed in logic, the judge continues. This was not a moment of rage. It was a series of decisions, chosen, calculated, and executed with chilling precision. You not only murdered your parents, you attempted to erase them. And then, without a flicker of hesitation, the sentence, 2 life terms, to be served concurrently, without the possibility of parole. The courtroom doesn't erupt, it exhales. Even the journalists, who've been typing feverishly all week, slow down. Jonathan shows no reaction. He stands when told, he leaves when escorted. No backward glance, no parting words, just a man-shaped absence moving through a space he hollowed out. Outside, the crowd has gathered. News vans, locals, strangers. Some hold signs justice for Margaret and Edward, though no one seems entirely sure what justice looks like here. One reporter asks Amelia for comment. She says, quietly, he was always quiet. We thought he was just shy, but I think now he was just empty. She doesn't cry. Maybe she's done crying. Maybe there's nothing left to drain. Did you know that in some traditional Japanese households, there's a practice called kuyo, a ritual for mourning broken tools, even needles and scissors? The idea is that anything that once served you deserves respect in death. It makes you wonder, how do you grieve a person who chose to destroy you? That night, a candlelight vigil is held outside the Hartley home. Dozens of neighbors gather. Some bring flowers, some bring silence. A local vicar says a few words, mentions forgiveness. But forgiveness feels like a distant planet tonight. Jonathan's name is not spoken. Instead, they focus on Margaret, the woman who made lemon curd for church bake sales, who knitted mittens for children she didn't know, and Edward, who once helped install a ramp for a neighbor's aging dog, free of charge. The quiet kindnesses that don't make headlines. Someone plays Greensleeves on a small speaker, not because it was their favorite song, but because it sounds like something that belongs to a gentler version of this world. And you, standing on the edge of the crowd, wonder how many other homes hold secrets like this. How many stories hover just behind curtains and cracked driveways? How many Jonathans sit quietly in family photos, already missing behind their eyes? You notice a child nearby asking their parent, why would someone do that to their mom? The parent doesn't answer. They just hold the child a little tighter. Because some questions don't have safe answers, and some stories don't end with peace, just silence. You wake to headlines. The Hartley case. Inside the mind of a killer son. Boiling point. How a quiet dropout became England's most chilling domestic killer. Jonathan. Thin's face is everywhere. That yearbook photo, neatly cropped hair, vacant expression becomes the image of horror. Not because he looks like a monster, but because he doesn't. The media dives in, teeth bared. Morning shows bring in psychologists. Commentators argue over mental illness, over privilege, over the rising tide of adult children failing to launch. It's a feeding frenzy dressed as analysis. Meanwhile, investigators are still combing through what Jonathan left behind. The flat where he hid becomes a second crime scene. Nothing bloody, nothing grotesque. But what they find is arguably more disturbing. A second notebook, black this time, lined in blue ink, titled, Contingency Plan If Needed. You might expect panicked ramblings. What you get instead is clinical. Drafts of emails explaining his disappearance, fake texts from friends he never had, a full itinerary for a ferry to France under the alias Daniel Ashcroft, backup routes in case of road closures, times of border checks, and one line, if caught, say nothing. They'll write the story anyway. He wasn't wrong. Police find receipts for prepaid phones, 3 in total, 2 unused. They find a burner laptop, wiped clean, but not thoroughly enough. Recovery software pulls fragments from the drive. Deleted search terms like acid disposal time human remains, pension transfer after death, and chillingly how to stage a break-in. Historians still argue whether the original London detectives of the 1800s believed that intent mattered more than evidence. This case proves how disturbingly well those two can align. And then there's the fridge. Nothing grotesque inside. No trophies, no hidden parts. carts. Just order 2 rows of bottled water, 4 apples, a tub of margarine, and a single Tupperware container filled with rice and sliced carrots. Dated, labeled, organized, as if he was preparing for a perfectly normal week. The psychological profile compiled by the Metropolitan Forensic Behavioral Team reads like a catalog of quiet malfunctions. Social isolation with functional mimicry. Possible narcissistic structure masked by self-pity. No markers of hallucination or delusion. High-functioning planning with moral disengagement. In short, he wasn't detached from reality. He just excluded it. You sit with that, because that's what chills you now, not the barrels or the stove or the journal. But the fact that this wasn't some man spiraling into madness, it was a plan. Drafted, revised, executed, like a school project no one asked for. There's a moment buried in one of the reports that keeps you up. A neighbor, an older man named Harold who lived 2 doors down, gave a statement. He remembered Jonathan from years ago, said he used to see him fixing things in the yard. Radios, model cars, even a broken sprinkler once. He was always quiet. Harold said, but not rude. He'd look at you like he was trying to understand what kind of person you were. Did he ever speak to you? The officer asked. Once, Harold replied. He said, some things are easier to take apart than put back together. I thought he was talking about the radio. A pause. Now I'm not so sure. Did you know that in 18th century France, clockmakers were considered among the most precise artisans, not just for their tools, but for how they handled time itself? Jonathan felt like one of them. Only his clock wasn't ticking forward. It was counting down. A week after sentencing, his cell is searched again. Standard procedure. They find a piece of soap carved into a small rectangular block. Not dangerous, but odd, carved with straight edges and tiny notches. A replica of a notebook. He'd even etched fake lines across it with the corner of a paperclip. Why? No one can answer. Maybe it was comfort, maybe a reminder, maybe just habit. But there it sat, a notebook made of soap, useless, pointless, but deliberate. You start to realize Jonathan's entire life was a series of rehearsals for control. When medicine failed him, he turned to design. When family disappointed him, he plotted endings. And when it all collapsed, he didn't weep. He organized, because to him, chaos wasn't frightening. It was inevitable, but order, that was a choice. And his final choice was to erase the mess, even if it meant erasing everything else too. The tabloids lose interest faster than you expect. By week 3, Jonathan Hartley's name slips below the fold, pushed aside by celebrity divorces, football drama, and something about a rare eclipse. But in Hawthorne Vale, no one forgets. Not the barista who served Margaret her last flat white, not the retired grocer who once helped Edward lift bags of compost into his car, and definitely not the neighbors, who now walk their dogs a little faster when they pass the Hartley home. You return there, metaphorically at least, just to stand outside it again. It's still sealed. Windows shuttered. Garden overgrown. A notice flaps against the front door. Under investigation. Do not enter. But it doesn't stop with the whispers or the flowers. One morning, someone ties a single daffodil to the gate, then another. Soon there's a cluster yellow against gray, defiant little spears of spring. People say it's for Margaret. Some say Edward, but no one mentions Jonathan, not even in hushed tones. In fact, the town has created a sort of verbal quarantine around him. He's the boy. That one, her youngest. No one wants to say the name out loud anymore. Historians still argue whether medieval English villages used silence as a form of punishment, ostracizing those who broke the unspoken code. But in Hawthorne Vale, silence is now its own language, and everyone speaks it fluently. Back at the small accounting firm where Margaret worked, her desk remains untouched. Gregor, her manager, can't bring himself to clear it. Her mug still rests beside the monitor. Best mum ever. It reads, no one's brave enough to put it in a box. Amelia and Andrew handle the estate with quiet precision. They meet with solicitors, attend hearings, and coordinate the eventual sale of the house. But in every action, you can feel the heaviness. Not grief, not exactly. Weight, that's the word that keeps surfacing. A gravitational pull around the absence of answers. Because the truth is, nobody really knows why. Yes, there was resentment. Yes, Jonathan felt isolated. but families survive worse. Siblings argue, sons drift. Parents say careless things. That's life. So why murder? Why dissolve? Why boil? That's the part that won't settle. There's one more piece to the puzzle. Quietly, almost too quietly, the Crown releases the final inventory of evidence. Among the recovered items is a USB drive, plain, unlabeled, found tucked in a sock at the bottom of Jonathan's duffel bag. Inside are notes, audio logs, dozens of them, recordings of Jonathan speaking to himself. You listen to the first one. His voice is calm, even bored. Tuesday, 11:23 p.m. Tried a new formula. Too slow, smells bad, need stronger bass. Then another. Mom said she's proud of me for helping around the house. Smile was fake. All of it is fake. The recordings stretch back months. Margaret never knew. Edward never heard. These were soliloquies to no one. A digital mirror for a mind losing its ability to reflect. In one file, labeled final, he says, "They gave up on me. They just didn't say it out loud. But I saw it. Every day, every meal, every look." He pauses. "I didn't kill them. I erased the lie." You pause there. Rewind it. Listen again. "I erased the lie." Not "I lost control." Not "I couldn't help it." But a surgical rationale, like he was fixing a spreadsheet. Did you know that during the Enlightenment, some philosophers believed pure logic could lead to moral perfection? Turns out, when you subtract empathy from the equation, you don't get perfection. You get Jonathan. The media never reports on the recordings. Too late, too quiet. And maybe it's better that way. The damage is already done. More exposure would only deepen the wound. Eventually, the house is sold to a couple from Norwich who didn't read the full listing history. They paint the kitchen, rip out the stove. No one tells them, but the neighbors do stop waving. And that's its own kind of history. You sit with all of this still trying to make sense of a boy who wanted love, or maybe control, or maybe just silence. And you begin to realize there's no grand revelation coming, no final truth waiting at the end of a string. Sometimes the why is as mangled as the what. You pull back the lens, just a little, to see what doesn't make the headlines. The ripple effect, the debris field. The insurance company denies the payout. Technically, under a Slayer rule clause, a beneficiary cannot profit from a murder they commit. But because Margaret listed all 3 children jointly, the remaining 2, Amelia and Andrew, inherit by default. Not that it feels like a victory. The solicitor says it plainly during a quiet meeting over tea and paperwork. It's yours, but it won't feel like yours, and that's okay. They nod. They understand. Instead of dividing the money, they agree to donate the majority to a small domestic violence and trauma recovery charity based in Somerset. It had nothing to do with their mother's case directly, but it had everything to do with rebuilding lives. Still, they keep enough to pay for therapy and a small plaque, just a brass rectangle set into the stone path outside St. Clement's Church. It reads, "For Margaret and Edward, loved, remembered, home." There's no mention of how they died, because some truths are too large for metal. But behind the scenes, not everything closes neatly. One journalist, Rachel Huxley, becomes obsessed with the case. Not the crime itself. She says she's seen enough butcher's tales to last a lifetime. But with the question, what breaks someone quietly? She dives deep, interviews childhood friends, teachers, classmates from uni. She finds a tutor who remembers Jonathan brilliant on paper, almost robotic in person. He handed in essays like surgical notes, but when I asked how he felt about his failures, he just blinked, like I'd spoken in code. Rachel publishes a long-form profile in The Observer titled, "The Heart That Never Formed." Inside Jonathan Hartley, it doesn't offer closure, but it does offer texture, and that's something. In it, she writes, Jonathan Hartley didn't snap. He settled over time, like a house slowly rotting from the inside, until one day, the roof caves in and people say, but it looked fine yesterday. Historians still argue whether evil is born or made. Rachel suggests it might also be accumulated, layered like sediment, until you don't recognize the foundation anymore. The article includes a small detail few others mention. Jonathan's medical records as a child showed signs of selective mutism and early social withdrawal. Not uncommon, not predictive, but maybe, just maybe, a whisper of what could have been addressed could have been helped. Instead, it went quiet. And that silence stretched like taffy into adulthood, into failure, into bitterness. Until one day, it didn't stretch anymore. It snapped. You learn that his siblings never visited him. Not once. And never planned to. The prison, a gray block outside Winchester, reports that Jonathan requested a single book on arrival, Gray's Anatomy, not the TV show, the surgical textbook. He hasn't spoken to anyone since sentencing, not staff, not clergy, not psychiatrists, and yet, every Thursday at 3:00 p.m., he walks 5 circles in the prison yard, clockwise, always 5, then sits alone. Did you know that in some monastic orders, walking a labyrinth was seen as a substitute for pilgrimage, a journey inward when the world outside had no destination left? Jonathan's version is stripped of meaning, but it's still ritual. In a letter to the prison's mental health review board, one attending psychologist writes, "He is present but inert, conscious but hollow. The lights are on, but the furniture has been deliberately removed." You think back to the daffodils on the gate, to the carved soap notebook, to the word erasure, and something settles in your chest, not quite understanding, but a kind of acceptance that you'll never understand. Some crimes aren't about hate. They're about absence, about what's missing: emotion, empathy, connection, like a house without plumbing, a body without nerves. Margaret loved her son. You know this. It radiated in every meal, every soft-spoken encouragement. And yet, in the end, love wasn't the question. Recognition was, and Jonathan couldn't give it. Not to her, not to anyone. You walk through Hawthorne Vale again, not in person, but in memory. It's mid-autumn, nearly a year since the murders. The leaves crunch beneath your shoes, and the street looks deceptively peaceful. But you notice it now, the way conversation dips as you pass certain homes. How eyes avoid the old Hartley house even though it's been painted over. There's a plaque in the church garden, a bench in the park, a scholarship fund in Margaret's name at the local school. But the wound is still there. The kind of scar you don't notice until something brushes against it. Down at the Hollow Fox, the town's only pub with edible chips and semi-reliable Wi-Fi, the locals still talk about it quietly. When the younger patrons are out of earshot, they whisper things like, "You never really know your kids, do you? He used to help carry the hymn books." Remember, one woman says she saw him in church just 2 weeks before the murders, sitting alone in the back, staring at the stained glass. She thought he looked sad. She never thought he looked dangerous. But that's the part that gnaws at this town. There were no red flags, no police records, no drugs, no late-night screaming. Just a young man who slipped through the cracks while living inside the house. Did you know that during the Renaissance, doctors believed melancholia, what we now call depression, was caused by black bile in the blood? They bled patients, fed them herbs, even locked them away. We laugh at it now, but then again, how well are we really doing? No one noticed Jonathan fading. Or maybe they noticed and mistook it for something else: shyness, apathy, an awkward phase that never quite ended. Even his old teachers struggle. One of them, Miss Ellery, writes a letter to a newspaper. He wasn't disruptive, just absent. I remember giving him a prize once for neat handwriting. He smiled, but it never reached his eyes. I wish I'd asked more. She isn't alone in that. The post office clerk remembers selling him stamps 3 days before the murders. He was polite, said thank you twice, asked if I liked the rain. Who asks that? A neighbor down the lane remembers him asking about fox repellents, said they were getting into the compost, but they weren't. I checked. A small lie, tucked inside a bigger one. And now, even the smallest memories feel suspicious in hindsight. Historians still argue whether folklore monsters, vampires, werewolves were really just metaphors for people we couldn't explain. You begin to wonder if this town has started building one of its own. You hear someone call him the boy who boiled his mother under their breath. Another calls him the acid son. Someone else says nothing at all, just nods toward the house and makes the sign of the cross. You sit on the church bench for a while. It's cold, the kind of cold that wraps around your bones without asking permission. And you think about Margaret. You think about her soft voice in the kitchen, her calendar with birthdays marked in bright pink. You think about Edward's obsession with crossword puzzles, the way he read the Times in his slippers. hours, and you realize that what makes this case so unbearable isn't the horror itself, it's the proximity of it. These weren't strangers in a faraway city. They were parents, neighbors, people who remembered your birthday, people who waved at Bin Man, and the son who took it all away didn't come from a war zone or a cult or a dark corner of the web. He came from Sunday roast dinners and knitted mittens. And that makes it worse, because if it can happen here quiet, cozy Hawthorne Vale, it can happen anywhere. You take a closer look at the one relationship most people don't want to talk about, Edward and Jonathan. Because behind every family tragedy is a fracture, and this one didn't happen overnight. Edward Hartley, by all accounts, was a man of firm lines, mechanical engineer by trade, church elder by routine, crossword champion by stubborn obsession. People say he was disciplined, serious, old school, a man who expected things to be done the right way the first time, especially by his sons. Amelia, the eldest, was spared most of that. Andrew caught glimpses, but Jonathan, he lived in it. From an early age, there was tension. Edward didn't believe in excuses. When Jonathan got a C in physics, Edward didn't ask what happened. He asked what went wrong. If Jonathan missed football practice, Edward didn't ask if he was feeling all right. He asked if he was lazy, not out of cruelty, not exactly, but out of a belief that pushing made men stronger. Historians still argue whether Victorian fathers were colder by culture or necessity. Either way, warmth wasn't Edward's strength. He taught Jonathan how to change a tire, build a shelf, recite multiplication tables backward, but he never said, "I'm proud of you," not once. The closest he came, according to Andrew, was the day Jonathan got into medical school. Edward nodded and said, "You'll need better posture to carry that kind of title." Jonathan laughed at the time, but later that night, he sat alone in the garage for over an hour. Margaret would try to soften the blows. She slipped cash into Jonathan's wallet before exams. She made his favorite lamb stew when he came home from university. She told him, over and over, he loves you in his way. But love, when filtered through correction, starts to sound like criticism. And Jonathan, already introverted, already self-doubting, internalized it all. When he dropped out of medical school, he didn't tell Edward right away. He couldn't. He spent weeks pretending, leaving the house at 7:30, returning at 5:00, telling stories that slowly became harder to maintain. Margaret found out first. She begged him to tell his father, said they'd understand, said it wasn't the end. But Jonathan saw it as just that. He imagined the conversation before it happened, the disappointment, the lecture, the inevitable silence. So he said nothing. Until he had to. Edward's reaction was exactly what Jonathan expected. Tight-lipped, arms crossed, followed by 2 hours of what now questions. He told him to apply for internships, to volunteer at clinics, to start acting like a man. Jonathan didn't respond. He just nodded. But inside, something twisted, because for Jonathan, this wasn't failure. It was betrayal. He had tried, and now, instead of support, he felt judgment. Instead of help, he felt the slow door of emotional exile swinging shut. Did you know that some ancient Greek thinkers believed memory lived in the chest, not the mind? That pain, when stored too long, became identity. Jonathan wore that pain like armor. And in time, like all armor, it began to rust. One neighbor recalled seeing the two of them gardening. Maybe a year before the murders, Edward barked instructions while Jonathan, silent, dug holes. She said something was wrong with the air between them. The neighbor recalled, like you could feel the resentment without hearing it. And then came the big conversation, the one Jonathan transcribed in that red notebook. According to the journal, 2 weeks before the murders, Edward sat him down and told him he and Margaret were moving to Somerset by spring. Downsizing. Time for us to start to the next chapter, he said. Jonathan asked if they wanted him to come. Edward apparently smiled and said, "You've got to stand on your own sometime." That was the moment. Not the acid, not the barrels, not the search histories. That sentence. Because for Jonathan, that wasn't advice. It was abandonment. In his warped perception, they weren't starting the next chapter, they were ending his. And that's when the planning began. The journal entries turned sharp after that conversation, pages filling with diagrams, lists, disposal methods, each line more clinical than the last. There is one note written in faint pencil in the corner of a page. Maybe he'll understand when he's gone. But Edward didn't get that chance. The forensics team determined he likely died first. Blunt force trauma while in the garden shed, perhaps checking tools, perhaps unaware that the man standing behind him wasn't just bitter, but ready. Margaret, the report says, may have been sedated before death. There were traces of sleeping pills in her bloodstream, enough to cloud, not to kill. Maybe he thought it was mercy. Maybe he just didn't want her to fight. Either way, Edward's final look at his son wasn't one of forgiveness. It was surprise. He returned to her, not the victim on the news or the headlined horror, but to Margaret. She deserves that. You imagine her now, not as a headline or a courtroom footnote, but as she truly was. Cardigan folded over the back of her chair, vanilla-scented lotion on her hands, humming when she cooked because it filled the silence left by other people's distractions. Margaret Hartley was a woman of rituals, small ones. Morning tea, 2 sugars, never stirred. Evening walk, 15 minutes. No matter the weather. Friday socks, purple polka dots. Her favorite. She was an accountant by profession, but a mother by instinct. Her colleagues often said she had that kind of warmth, the kind that made even audits feel personal. One junior staff member wrote later in a condolence letter, "She remembered my cat's name. Nobody else in the office ever did. She did things like that. Quiet, unnoticed kindnesses. The kind of love that rarely gets thanked, but always gets missed. And yet, none of it could save her." Historians still argue whether the Victorian ideal of womanhood nurturing, patient, forgiving protected women or imprisoned them. Margaret somehow managed both. She loved her son deeply. That much is clear. You see it in the small notes she left around the house, in handwriting rounded by years of patient motherhood. Remember to eat. Washing machine's tricky, don't yank it. Ask if stuck. If you need help with forms, I can look. They weren't just reminders. They were anchors, subtle tethers between her and the son who barely looked up from his phone anymore. She never stopped hoping for him. Even after he dropped out, even after he stopped coming to family events, even when his room became a cave of silence and sleeplessness, she never gave up. Andrew later admitted that Margaret used to sneak Jonathan extra money behind Edward's back. "He doesn't need to know," she'd say. "He's just struggling a bit." It wasn't enabling. Not to her. It was survival. You find yourself asking, when did she know? Not when the police arrived. Not when her boss reported her missing. But when she knew, was it the night she heard the garage door close quietly? The time she noticed bleach on his sleeves? The moment he offered to make her tea and it tasted faintly wrong? Forensics confirmed the presence of zopiclone in her bloodstream, a powerful sedative, commonly used to treat insomnia, not something she was prescribed. The assumption is that Jonathan drugged her before the murder, to make it easier, to make her go still. But one haunting theory, raised during the autopsy, is this: she may have seen it coming and taken the pills herself to not feel it, to not scream, to just fade. It's never confirmed. The dosage sits in a gray zone enough to fog her mind, not quite enough to knock her out completely. And so we're left with a chilling image. Margaret, drowsy and disoriented, realizing what her son is doing, reaching for him, trying to say his name, and being met not with recognition but cold, practiced silence. One of the forensic technicians, a mother herself, was reported to have stepped outside when processing the kitchen. She had found a to-do list stuck to the fridge. Groceries, carrots, chicken thighs, bin bags, Jonathan's favorite cereal, if he's still here. A life mid-lived, a love mid-tried, not a martyr, just a mum. Did you know that in Norse tradition, women who died protecting their households were sometimes elevated to semi-mythical status? Shield maidens. Even in death, Margaret never held a sword, but she defended her home until the very last whisper of trust. There's one line in Jonathan's journal that breaks pattern. Amid the checklists and diagrams, you find this: "She wouldn't stop looking at me like I was 5. It's written messier, angled, as if his hand was shaking, and that's the part that lingers, because maybe, even in the final seconds, she looked at him with love. Maybe that was the last thing he couldn't erase. And maybe that's why he turned the stove on. To burn the look from his memory, to boil the past off her face, to destroy what wouldn't stop forgiving him. You turn now to the battlefield of the mind where experts clashed not with swords, but with diagnoses. Because if anything could explain this, surely it would come from the field of psychiatry. Or at least, that's what everyone wanted to believe. That there must be a term, a pattern, a file with a checklist, something. Jonathan Hartley underwent 2 separate psychological evaluations during pre-trial, not because he requested them, but because the court demanded them. The horror of the case was too precise, too controlled, to ignore the question, was he mad or just monstrous? Historians still argue whether the 19th century legal standard of insanity, the McNaughton rule, does more to protect justice or obscure it. In Jonathan's case, the rule became a razor. The first psychiatrist, Dr. Clara Sutherland, leaned towards schizoid personality disorder. She testified that Jonathan showed persistent patterns of detachment from social relationships, restricted range of emotional expression, and indifference to both praise and criticism. Her phrasing was clinical, measured. He is not driven by rage or delusion. He is driven by vacancy. She stopped short of claiming full psychosis, said his logic was intact, his planning impeccable, his morality absent, but not broken. She was clear, he knew what he was doing, and he knew it was wrong. The second expert, Dr. Malcolm Evers, was less sure. He pointed to childhood indicators, selective mutism, sensory withdrawal, flat affect in early interviews. He hinted at possible autistic spectrum traits, perhaps complicated by undiagnosed depressive episodes. He suggested that a toxic mix of emotional neglect, unrealistic expectations, and social incompetence could have created a cognitive detachment so severe it bordered on delusional logic. In other words, Jonathan didn't just plan the murders, he rationalized them. Evers testified he wasn't trying to escape, he was trying to complete a process. Emotionally, he had already left the family years before. This was him aligning reality to match that inner detachment. It sounded like poetry, but the court didn't buy it. A third evaluator was brought in neutral, government appointed. She issued a sharp, cold report. The subject displays traits of narcissism cloaked in victimhood. No evidence of psychosis, hallucinations, or impaired reality testing. He is simply a man who chose to sever all emotional ties, then acted accordingly. This is not insanity. This is resolve without empathy. And yet, in the courtroom, no one could quite let go of the question, because if he wasn't insane, then, what was he? Did you know that in ancient Mesopotamia, there were professional dream readers who interpreted madness as messages from angry gods? If Jonathan had lived then, maybe someone would have thrown salt, burned sage, or blamed a curse. Instead, in modern England, we have court-appointed psychiatrists, brain scans, and symptom clusters, and none of it really helps. The defense tried to argue diminished responsibility, that even if Jonathan knew right from wrong, his capacity for rational behavior had been severely impaired by a lifelong emotional disconnect and a sudden psychological break. But the prosecution countered with surveillance footage, receipts, the staged voicemail, the notebook, the method, the bleach. This was not a break. The prosecutor said, this was a blueprint. You remember one moment during testimony that silenced the room more than any photo or chart. The prosecutor asked the court psychologist, if you had to describe Jonathan Hartley in one word, what would it be? She paused, then said, absence. Not evil, not broken, just not there. As if he were a simulation walking among us, perfectly imitating a son. A student, a human until it no longer needed to, and that might be the most terrifying diagnosis of all, because it means he could have passed for any of us. You, the person behind you in the queue, the quiet guy in your uni tutorial, the neighbor who never caused trouble. We search for signs in hindsight because we desperately want to believe we could see it coming next time. But what if there are no signs? What if sometimes the darkness is quiet? What if sometimes it lives in a room across the hall, listens to your laughter at dinner, and then, hours later, searches for barrel prices on incognito mode? What then? You reach the end of the legal road, where justice is no longer a theory, but a sentence engraved in stone. Jonathan Hartley has been convicted, 2 life sentences, no chance of parole, and the courtroom empties. But some words hang in the air long after the chairs are stacked. The judge's final statement, spoken with the kind of calm fury you only hear in rooms where truth is too heavy to lift, still echoes in your mind. This was not merely a murder, it was a calculated betrayal of love, a crime against humanity within one's own bloodline. It was unusual phrasing. A crime against humanity, normally reserved for dictators, war criminals, the architects of genocide. But here, the phrase landed on the shoulders of a quiet, pale man who once spent Sunday afternoons assembling Lego sets in the living room. And yet it fit, because this wasn't about rage, it wasn't about snapping, it was about something colder. It was about the deliberate demolition of a bond. Historians still argue whether early English common law treated parricide, the killing of one's parents, as a separate, deeper offense. In practice, it was always punished more harshly. Because it didn't just offend the law, it offended nature. Jonathan didn't just end lives, he ended belonging. In the weeks after sentencing, people across the country ask the same thing. Could something have stopped this? The debates unfold in media panels and kitchen tables. Should mental health services have caught the signs? Should the school have intervened more? Should the family have been more attentive? But those questions never land, because they all assume one thing: that Jonathan wanted help. He didn't. That's the part that breaks people. He never reached out, never screamed, never gave anyone a chance to pull him back. He sank quietly and then struck deliberately at St. Clement's Church. A memorial is held again, this time without cameras. Just those who knew them, really knew them. Margaret's best friend reads a letter she found folded in an old recipe book. It was written by Margaret, never sent, addressed to Jonathan. It said, "I know things feel dark right now. I just want you to remember we don't measure your worth by achievements. We measure it by how much you try. And I see that. I always will. Love, Mom." The room goes silent. Someone sobs quietly in the back. That letter never reached him. Or maybe it did, and he just refused to let it in. Edward is remembered too, with more restraint. A stern man, yes, but not unloving. A father who believed in structure, who didn't know that structure without softness can become a cage. The two of them now exist as memory mosaics, bits of stories. I remember your mom fixed my dress hem at church. Your dad once helped me jumpstart my car at 6 a.m. Down in the snow. People collect these like puzzle pieces, trying to rebuild a picture of who they were without the stain of how they died. Did you know that in some cultures, a person's soul isn't believed to fully pass on until their name is spoken in kindness 300 times? Margaret and Edward will get there, eventually. But Jonathan's name, it's already vanishing. The press moves on. The files are archived. His siblings Amelia and Andrew legally request to have no contact. They decline interviews. They move house. They decline his letters. They change their phone numbers. Yes, he wrote to them. 3 months into his sentence, a handwritten letter arrived for Amelia. She didn't open it. Neither did the solicitor. They shredded it, burned it, deleted the prison copy from their system. Whatever he has to say, Amelia told the solicitor, it's too late for her. And so, Jonathan becomes what he was always becoming. A silence, not just locked away, but folded away, like a chapter best skipped over, a paragraph blacked out. He still walks those 5 circles in the prison yard every Thursday, still hasn't spoken to anyone since sentencing, still sits alone during meals. But he writes small, neat pages, notebooks smuggled in by no one's standard issue, observations, diagrams, daily logs. He files them in a small box labeled proof of thought, as if trying to convince the walls around him that he still exists. But the world, it no longer waits for him. And as leaves fall again on Hawthorne Vale, the home he once haunted finally sells for good. A young couple moves in. They repaint the door. They don't ask what came before. Time moves forward in Hawthorne Vale. Not quickly, not loudly, but inevitably, the house is now lemon yellow. That's the first thing people notice. It's the kind of color you don't choose unless you're trying to cover something up, or maybe chase the dark out by force. The new owners plant lavender beneath the front window, hang a ceramic sun on the porch. You can almost feel them trying to overwrite the history. One cheerful touch at a time. And honestly, it works. A little but not entirely. Because the past doesn't vanish. It just settles into the cracks between floorboards, into the way certain neighbors still glance away when they pass, into the awkward pause when someone new asks, "What happened there?" No one answers directly. Not anymore. They say, "It was a long time ago." They say, "The family moved away." They say, "It's not our story to tell." Because after everything, after the arrests and the trials and the headlines and the flowers, there's one thing everyone in Hawthorne Vale agrees on. Jonathan Hartley doesn't get to own the story. Margaret and Edward do, and their legacy is stronger than the silence he left behind. Margaret's memorial scholarship now helps students who need a second chance. Students who fail, who fall behind, who get up again. One recipient wrote in her thank you letter, "Your story reminds me that failure isn't a death sentence." She'd never met Margaret, but somehow she knew her. Edward's old tools, donated quietly by Andrew, now live at the community shed, helping fix garden gates and lawnmowers for pensioners who can't afford the labor. The man who never knew how to say "I'm proud of you" now helps strangers with broken things. In a way, the family did move to Somerset, just not how they planned. Amelia and Andrew visit occasionally, quietly, never together. They sit by the bench at St. Enos. Clements. They leave white flowers. They never speak Jonathan's name. And somewhere in the bowels of a prison outside Winchester, Jonathan walks his 5 silent circles, still, still, still. He writes, though no one reads it. He eats, though no one watches. He dreams, perhaps, though no one will ever ask. Did you know that in some versions of Dante's Inferno, the lowest circle of hell isn't fire, it's ice? Absolute stillness. No movement, no sound, no recognition, just endless reflection. Alone. Jonathan isn't tortured. He's forgotten. And maybe that's the justice no one speaks of. Because when you erase your family, when you strip away their faces, their futures, their kindness, you don't just go to prison. You lose your place in the story forever. And now, let's let go. Let the doors close softly behind us. Let the courtroom echo fade. Let the cold, yellow house dissolve back into the mist. You followed every shadow, every question, every whispered why, and maybe you still don't have the answer. Maybe you never will, but that's okay. Some stories aren't meant to be solved, only remembered, so they don't happen again. Let the lavender on the windowsill bloom. Let Margaret's cardigan hang softly in memory. Let Edward's crossword sit unfinished. One last clue unsolved. Because the most human thing we can do is leave space for the things we'll never fully understand. As you drift, now eyes heavy, thoughts gentle. Imagine that bench under the oak tree at Saundent. Clements, sunlight slanting through the leaves, a breeze carrying the faintest trace of vanilla and wet earth. You sit, you breathe, you rest. And in the distance, a church bell rings, not for mourning, not for fear, just for the slow turning of time. You're safe now. The story is over, and the silence that remains is a quiet one, a peaceful one. Good night.